this regime is gambling because we are open. It's an open society. It's an open book. The fights amongst Americans in America are so public and so plain. It's a fundamentally different battlefield that they are not just escalating against conventionally, but they're escalating against in a whole host of ways to be able to shape the debate, to be able to get Americans to fight Americans and Americans to constrain Israelis. Because when you have the adversary fight itself or amongst itself, well, then it doesn't matter that conventionally you don't have the military capabilities that they do.
Our guest today is Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of the Iran Program at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. For over a decade, he's been one of America's leading experts on the Islamic Republic of Iran, its leadership, the IRGC, nuclear ambitions, regional proxies, and long-term strategy. His analysis has informed policymakers, testified before Congress, and appeared in major outlets around the world. But today, I don't want to spend an hour talking about headlines. I want to understand how the Islamic Republic thinks. Why does the regime keep escalating when it knows it can't defeat Israel or the United States militarily? What does Tehran understand about America that many Americans still don't understand about Iran? And what does the regime believe comes next? Behnam, it's an honor to have you here. Welcome.
It's such a pleasure to be with you. Thank you, Daniel. Greetings to you and your family and friends and listeners.
Thank you. Now, everyone agrees that the Islamic Republic cannot defeat Israel or the United States militarily. So what does this regime understand about America, our politics, our media, our elections, our economy, and even our divisions that still gives them confidence to keep escalating this war?
Well, that's precisely it. It's not just a direct face-to-face, almost 1700 style. You line up your folks, we'll line up ours, and they, shoot and meet in the middle. The Islamic Republic has invested decades into an asymmetric military and security strategy that actually does use military means, but tries to affect something else, perhaps much more directly politically. And some of those constituencies are the political ones, subject to political push and pull forces, that the Islamic Republic uses military force unconventionally, asymmetrically, often in the gray zone, to try to target. When the Islamic Republic, through itself or via proxies, attacks U.S. forces in the region or attacks U.S. bases in the region, or places where U.S. personnel are located or co-located, the goal is to have that foster a sense of American kind of sensitivity and restraint and responsibility in a national debate here in America. Say, hey, why are we even here in the first place? They struck us. Why don't we just get out of it? It's designed to get America to roll itself up. It's designed to be part of a larger death by 1,000 cuts. And that was the big picture macro strategy. But then we got to last June, and then we got to this February, and the shadow war really came out of the shadows, not just against Israel, but against America as well. Overt, direct, conventional attacks from these two countries on Iranian territory at a time when this regime has felt more comfortable escalating directly. And so, the first thing I would say is that, perhaps they're making a mistake. And let's hope they're making a mistake. And let's hope Israel and America are ready to capitalize on that mistake, because they are not a conventional powerhouse. And that means that the more they try to respond and act like such, the more there is an opportunity, if there is the commensurate political will in America and in Israel, to say, hey, you just stepped out of the box. Now it's time to slap you back down. So there is that to it. But they're gambling, this regime is gambling, that America and Israel and the partners in the region will not be doing that. That gets to a different understanding of the American state, American society, and American strategy, that fundamentally, because we are open, it's an open society, it's an open book, the fights amongst Americans in America are so public and so plain. This is not the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal period of 2013 to 2015, where, okay, there's direct overt contact with the Americans after decades of nothing. I mean, this is the social media age. This is the digital age. This is, Tucker Carlson spoke to an Iranian president that was midwife via an Iranian podcast. This is an entirely different terrain. This is a terrain where the former director of national intelligence under President Joe Biden, Avril Haines, she She said in 2024 that there were pro-Palestinian groups protesting that didn't even know that they were organized by the Islamic Republic and worse, even paid by the Islamic Republic on U.S. territory. It's a fundamentally different battlefield that they are not just escalating against conventionally, but they're escalating against in a whole host of ways to be able to shape the debate, to be able to get Americans to fight Americans and Americans to constrain Israelis. Because when you have the adversary fight itself or amongst itself, well, then it doesn't matter that conventionally you don't have the military capabilities that they do.
Now, most people watch what Iran does. You've spent years studying how the regime thinks. What do you think is the single biggest misunderstanding that people have about the mindset of the Islamic Republic?
Well, there's a lot of extremes. Even in Washington, D.C., where I live and work, there's kind of two extremes. And I don't want to play, monkey in the middle or just for our listeners because you're Persian, I'll use this word. I don't want to be vasat pause either or play to the middle. But there's two schools of thought, and I think both are wrong because there's no understanding of the gray. One school in DC thinks that these guys in Tehran are like Kissinger and Bismarck, total hard-nosed strategists. And then the other side says, well, they're a crazed Islamist cults just like the rest of the other terrorist groups. There's kernels of truth in both. The Islamist cult one is much more closer to reality, but it doesn't do a good enough job alone explaining reality. Like if it's a cocktail, that's just the primary liqueur. It doesn't have any of the other accoutrements in there. So I think it's largely a combination, perhaps 70-30 of these forces, but it's 70-30 of these forces at a certain time via a certain audience, via a certain, character in the Islamic Republic. And, you mentioned the word think, and I wouldn't pretend to even, know what my neighbor thinks in their heart of hearts. But here's how you can get at this. One is you take the statements and the declarations and the things they've written, be it in books, websites, articles, traditional media, social media, and you marry that with their actions. And then you nest that marriage into history. And you make sense of that for purposes of U.S. strategy. That's as close as we can get to trying to understand the mindset and the zeitgeist of these guys. Each of these characters have different shades of opportunism, pragmatism, ideology, hardline. You name it. All these forces are there, and you see how they ebb and flow. For example, right now, one thing that Americans are missing, and one thing that I fear the Trump administration is mistaking, is this Speaker of Parliament figure, Mohammed Bafr Ghalibaf. I certainly think there's more American projection onto him than letting his record speak for itself. Someone's record speaks for themselves. Someone's rhetoric speaks for themselves. Someone's action speaks for themselves. And so Americans, they have a tendency sometimes to mirror image, and maybe not Americans or Westerners, but all people. They like to project onto, they use the frameworks, the intellectual shortcuts they have to make sense of things that are new to them. So they're constantly scoping, framing, making sense of new things using old metrics. And then they project, known knowns onto unknown knowns, to borrow a phrase from Donald Rumsfeld, former U.S. Secretary of Defense. And with respect to someone like Ghalibaf, I think the administration is looking for an Iranian version of Delcy Rodriguez. And the mistake I think they make is to not look at the behavior, to not look at the rhetoric, to not look at the reality, to not look at the past history, and to engage in that mirror imaging, to engage in that projection, and to have this happen due to a recency bias, such that you ignore the fact that this guy bragged about, protester suppression. You ignore the all of the anti-American and anti-Semitic things that have come out of him and his elite and the circles he used to cohabitate in, being an IRGC member, for example. And then ultimately, you mistake his opportunism for pragmatism, and you mistake that pragmatism for moderation. And that's how you get to begin to make mistakes.
Now, when the regime looks at America today, what do you think it actually sees? Does it see weakness, strength, division, opportunity? Same thing with Israel. What do you think they see?
I think it's almost impossible, and this is, again, with respect to both people in both offices, it's impossible to divide that right now without talking about the people at the helm. I mean, there's the Islamic Republic's enmity and hatred with Israel, but then there's the unique phase of that under the prime ministership of Bibi Netanyahu. There is the Islamic Republic's enmity with America, but then there's the unique phase of that with Donald Trump at the helm. And I don't care if you're Republican or Democrat or Likud or Labor or any of the orientation, up, down, left, right, it's not my business. But it is my business to get folks to understand how the adversary characterizes the threats they face. And in the premiership and presidency of these two individuals, that threat has moved in very unique directions because these two folks have led their societies and their states in the most overt version of the fight against the Islamic Republic. So there's a special enmity there. And so while there is a real danger there in terms of the substance of how the regime sees the threat from the state and then the leader and the society, it is very different. Certainly in
Mhm.
terms of the Americans, they know the Americans are more military capable. But certainly when it comes to the Israelis, they know that it's a fundamentally different nature of the fight. Even, for example, in the past war, the 40-day war, which I think is what we're calling it, the Israelis were the only one who were willing to target this thing called the apparatus of repression. The Basij, the law enforcement forces, the IRGC, and they didn't even do it for a very long time, but they did it. The Americans didn't go after those targets. The Americans went after the defense targets, the military targets, the industrial targets. And yes, the Israelis followed suit, but at least they took some time to address this threat. The Israelis are seen or believed to be much more focused on the regime and the nature of the regime, and there's no fooling them. Versus with the Americans, by virtue of distance, by virtue of politics, by virtue of history, everything, you name it, there is things that cannot be undone, like time and distance and geography. And, this is a regime that is hoping that currents that are organic in America about isolationism, about retreat and restraint can be magnified to get America to simply extract itself. Now, that doesn't mean the U.S.-Iran enmity is over, but it means that the U.S. fundamentally is not in the region and has less leverage. And so, despite the Islamic Republic seeing America as more capable, I think it sees Israel as more resolute. And that link between state and society and the leader is more cohesive, despite Israel having, again, lots of fractious factions. And again, they're in an electoral cycle right now. And we only have to remember what it looked like in 2023 before 10/7, with the politics of the judicial reform, again, being so public and so rancorous. But at least in terms of the nature of the threat, I think the Islamic Republic sees greater linkage and synthesis. And so it is a very unique situation where the Islamic Republic is facing a regional superpower and a global superpower. But its ideology, it doesn't share a border with any of these countries. In fact, the history is more positive compared to the history of those countries and others in the region that surround Iran. The Islamic Republic's ideology keeps electing it into deeper and deeper and deeper confrontation with both countries, with both states. And in a unique era of these two political leaders, that is leading to quite explosive consequences. And, we could talk at length about how, there's different Iranian strategies about playing for time. But I think the Islamic Republic fears this duo, regardless of all the stuff that we see in the Western press. And the Islamic Republic is trying to run the clock on both of them. But the consequences of running the clock on America will be much greater because Israel obviously has operational capabilities, intelligence capabilities, you name it. But if that happens at a time when the U.S. is not willing to do the things it's done in the past 2 years, there's a real cap as to how far they could go.
Now, how important is somebody like Tucker Carlson's message for the Islamic Republic? Like you said, that America first, the isolationist message. How much does that play into what they're trying to do?
I think it has increasingly become important to them. I don't think it's important. I don't think it's wise, useful, politically or morally, to slander your fellow American. The things that those constituencies say. And again, actually, nothing wrong with America First. I mean, to divorce it first from its earlier Charles Lindbergh, yes, I mean, one should do that. But simply put, looking at the plain text, if we're going to get religious here, the peshat, the external, America, there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, it would be something majorly wrong if American politicians did not put America first in almost every order of business. But looking at the constituency, the demography, the changing debates, even you could even call it a Republican civil war between isolationism and internationalism. These are organic things that have existed. I mean, go back to the 50s, for example, Taft versus Eisenhower Republicans. These were real things. These were real divides. The paleocon versus what became the modern Republican Party in the Cold War that were much more interlationist. These are real things. And so Tucker does represent part of that. I think it's taken a really nasty turn, an opportunistically nasty political social turn that, at least in terms of some of the content that is put out, is borderline, if not overtly anti-Semitic. And the problem is when you think there is someone at his level who I believe does in his heart of hearts know better, that begins to be a problem. And the Islamic Republic, because it knows the power of the free space, the power of free media, the power of a free society, the power of a free street, and because it knows it because it's denied it to its people for so long. And when it sees an idea, catch steam, it wants to amplify it, but also it will simply enjoy the fact that it is being amplified organically already. So suffice to say, I think that it is totally possible for someone to be a patriotic American and be a useful idiot. And then at the same time, it's totally possible for someone to be a skeptical American and then be more willing to fall prey to narratives put out by a propaganda machine that is designed to take advantage of even loyal dissent first and to make it disloyal and then to really move you in a fundamentally different direction. I mean, I got to tell you, I have as someone who believes still in his heart of heart in expertise. I'm very disappointed in the status of American Academy today, of the American Academy today, because they haven't seen this. And I think they've fallen for it hook, line, and sinker. And there's institutional capture, but I wouldn't give our adversaries that depth of a win because it reminds me very much of this Nixon quote about Vietnam, where he says, North Vietnam cannot defeat or humiliate the United States. Only Americans can do that. Iran or Qatar or RT or some social media page cannot defeat Americans. It's Americans who elect into that willingly engage in this. So despite living and working in DC and, working on policy and being surrounded in the world of politics, I think the real answer to your question is a social one, is a human one. It's what you do outside of your 9 to 5, who you associate with outside of your 9 to 5, the kind of society, the kind of family you want to build. That'll be the best guardrail against the Islamic Republic or worse, countries that are more capable, like Russia or China, and their use and abuse of exactly this permissive environment.
If the Islamic Republic knows that it cannot win on the battlefield, then what does victory actually look like from the regime's perspective?
In the short term, victory for the regime is survival, but some denigrate that. I don't think it should be denigrated because, we see, okay, survival is the predicate to thriving, but this is a regime that really doesn't thrive. It doesn't know how to thrive as a state. There's enmity among itself. There's a rancorous debate among itself. This is a good enough for government work. I mean, pre-war, pre-deal, pre-protest, it was sliding towards failed state status. So just surviving is an achievement in the mind of these guys, and surviving against an adversary that they've hyped up and denigrated at the same time. Conversely, it's like this Bernard Lewis, famous historian, used to talk about anti-Semitism, saying, it's this double-edged sword because it's at once a weak constituency is that somehow controls the world. And so, the Islamic Republic denigrates America and Israel and then somehow propagandizes it at the same time and says, oh my goodness, and they're ruling and controlling everything. So here, survival is best understood against that backdrop that we have beaten back a regional and a global superpower, for example, and then the problem is they come to believe it, and they come to believe it, and you see them, which is a regime that has a poor hand, and they play that poor hand tactically well, and then they overplay that hand, and now quite literally in this new cycle, we're living in a world where they have overplayed that hand. And the question becomes not about them and what they do with survival, but how they squander their survival. And things that can impact their survival is, once the fog of war dissipates, not when things go back to normal, but when expectations begin to change. It took 6 months between the end of the 12-day war and the materialization of of the protests in late December, early January. And at FDD in early January, I led a small team that covered an environmental crisis. And folks may have said, why were you covering this environmental crisis that existed in 2025 and printing it and talking about it in early 2026 when there's this mass protest? Because we put out a map tracking over 60 unique environmental incidents, from fires to deforestation to, you name it. To pollution, to, dried up rivers. And the reason we did it is to show that between the 12-day war and the protests that started in late December, this was one of the measures of state failure. And look how geographically and demographically it had spread. So they understand that these things are coming for them. And that's precisely why they continue to extol survival, whereas any normal state would say that this is not good enough. They would look for the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. But that's why survival is magnified and the adversary put down in that way. And that magnification, and in the medium term, is hubristic. And therein is an opportunity for U.S. policy.
How much of the regime's decision making is driven by ideology? We know they're 12 are Shiites. They need to cause war in order to bring their Mahdi savior. How much is driven by cold strategic calculation?
Well, it's a combination, like I mentioned before. I think the cocktail, if you will, is heavily skewed towards ideology. We see them again in the face of an MOU, for example, that, there's 14 points in this MOU. The vast majority of them are things that are incumbent upon America to do rather than incumbent upon Iran to do. And all they had to do is kind of let the Strait alone for 60 days and negotiate. And they couldn't even do that in good faith. That's the hubris. That's the ideology injecting itself in ways that even limit their strategic gains when they're able to get those gains. So that is on, as you see, baked into the process. These two things aren't divorced from each other, though, because a rational person is someone who, or at least in the Weberian sense, someone who is means ends rational, can have lots of crazy ideological views. But the problem is rationality is measured by, in pursuit of those ideological views, what is it that I have to do to organize? What do I have to tune out? What ways, means do I have to get and align so I can get very rationally to my absolutely irrational end state? It's not messianism and then, full, end the conversation. Is in pursuit of that. How have they created a foreign policy? How have they built up a security strategy that has confounded us and the Israelis such that they could get to this ideological end state? They're not rushing for it. This is the problem. Even when you look at the nuclear program, for example, it's arraying the pieces. It's forcing us to call their bluff. This is not the world's fastest nuclear program, but it's tried for 3.5 decades, 4 decades to be the safest one, to inch towards the bomb. And now you've seen that debate change with the introduction of U.S. military force. And we're seeing something similar on the missile side. And we're seeing something similar on the terror proxy side. So, my, word of advice is, yes, it's a cocktail. Yes, it's highly slanted towards ideology, but that doesn't mean that they can't make opportunistic decisions as things come along. But to warn folks about this rational, irrational debate, to say that someone can do things totally rationally because they have an ideological or irrational end state. And that is what you have to fear. And, with the benefit of hindsight, we can say, actually, to that end, within the Islamic Republic, the Rouhani government, 2013 to 2021, was by many measures more dangerous than the Ahmadinejad government of 2005 to 2013. It's easy to make an argument against Ahmadinejad. It's quite hard, or it became harder, to make an argument by virtue of relative standing against Rouhani. And then capability. A much more capable adversary is a more dangerous adversary. And, when the Islamic Republic occasionally marries capability with confidence, then that's when things get dicey. So, my word of advice is this rational and irrational debate, be very wary of it, especially when you were trying to make sense of our adversaries that can be means ends in the Weberian sense, rational.
Do you think that the regime could accurately predict what President Trump will do next? He seems to be one of the most unpredictable presidents ever in American history. Does it frustrate them? Does it surprise them, the moves that he makes?
I would say throughout all of term one, President Trump absolutely confounded them. Absolutely. Term two is a little different. I mean, term two, I think the president in term two, year one, I like to say that he, this the phrase that people in DC say for many years, many presidents actually, all options on the table. Trump was that, but he was all options on the table at exactly or roughly the same time, or, right after another. February 2025, restore max pressure. April to June 2025, in nuclear negotiations. June 2025, support Israel. End of June 2025, strike Iran's nuclear facilities. August to October 2025, support the Europeans at the United Nations for snapback. Totally different directions and things that, in their own right would define a 4 or an 8-year presidency. He did 4 of them very different in 10 months. So he ran through the gambit of them. And that is confounding for this regime. But what, unfortunately, in term two, I think, with respect, has redounded to the benefit of the regime is there's that turbulence, but that turbulence has a pattern to it. And then you layer over the rhetoric and you see where the rhetoric can become hyperbolic or more often than not starts hyperbolic. There's always the chance of miscalculating. But unfortunately, today we're in a position where Iranian threats are more credible than American threats. And I'm not saying that as a first generation Iranian American, as someone who wants the president to carry out some of his threats. I don't think, for example, the threat against Iranian civilization was wise or moral. If anything, was the exact opposite. Conversely, the regime is going to still have to take it from the bully pulpit from this president. And sometimes you do wonder why he pulls punches, or sometimes you wonder why he's landing punches in a certain direction at a certain place when he could do so much more with so much less. And I fear that the Islamic Republic thinks that tactically it has found the pattern. And I think that one reason we saw the escalation in the Strait of Hormuz, despite them knowing that the Americans would hit them, is that the Americans would hit them in a non-game changing way. And that even if the president was going to resort to military force, it was a bridge or a pathway to a restoration of diplomacy, but at a different level with a different framework. And this is the hard-nosedness. This is the other side of the Islamic Republic. Yes, the escalation was brought to you by hubris, brought to you by ideology, so the large part of the cocktail. But the management of the crisis that an ideological issue got you into, unfortunately, that is brought to you by the hard-nosedness. And again, these are, symbiotic forces that are uneven, but, carry each other in this conflict against a much more powerful adversary like America. So it's therefore important for the president to be doing things and saying things that, cease to confound America's allies at home, left and right, abroad, transatlantic community, Five Eyes, E3, Israel, you name it, and that instead go back to confounding the adversary. Kind of like in term one, I think in the in the National Security Strategy or National Defense Strategy, I forget which one, it said, strategically predictable, operationally unpredictable. Strategically, the regime should know that we're coming for them, but operationally, they should not know how, when, where, why. And
Mhm.
I think that needs to be restored. And the Islamic Republic is gambling at the moment that it can tune out the president, that it's found the pattern to the turbulence. But the president, indeed, to use his own phrase, has all the cards here because he could simply reshuffle the deck and actually act on some of his threats or actually act or, go outside the box. And that would mean that the Islamic Republic would be forced to recalculate how they look at some of the things he says and in what context they assess the things that he does.
Do you think that the Islamic Republic ever comes to the negotiating table truly looking for peace, or is it always trying to buy time? Do they always have other ulterior motives?
I think they see the diplomatic option in the negotiations with their adversary as an extension of the battlefield. And they see the battlefield as an extension of the diplomatic space. And that is not unique to them. It is actually more unique to us that we have this separation. It is unique to the West where, violence is something to be shunned and eschewed. And even though elements of the government does it, you put it in a separate corner. And then conversely, the way the regime sees statecraft and its marriage with that kind of soulcraft, the desire to really smite the adversary, to get the best of them, to spook them wherever it is, to one up them. And that means at the negotiating table, a fundamentally different play. It's not just a play for time, it's a play for humiliation. It's at least with respect to the MOU to make the architect of max pressure look like the undertaker of max pressure. It's to get America to commit to things that would be seen as un-American. It's to get America to be, which is the stronger power, in the position of the supplicant, of a weaker power. These are things that negotiations are also used for the optics of the Islamic Republic. Strategically, with this president, yes, it's designed to be a play for time. It's designed, they understand he is a bull in a china shop. They understand he's unpredictable. And they understand that, yes, while they may have a pattern to his unpredictability, given his ability to shift the pattern or introduce a new variable like that into the equation, to merely act on one of the many diverse things that he said, that would be very risky. And so that's why it is a play for time, but it's not just a play for time. It's something that is nested into its larger competition with America. There is also something to that end that the new missile commander in Iran who replaced the IRGC Aerospace Force chief who was killed in the 12-day war. Hajizadeh was killed. His deputy, Majid Musavi, was promoted to the chief of that force. I think on the day that Iran attacked Israel, June 7th, which was the first time ever the regime ran cover for Hezbollah, he said something to the effect of marrying diplomacy with the battlefield. And that will be their approach moving ahead.
What do you think is the biggest strategic mistake that Washington could make over the next 6 months or so when it comes to dealing with the regime?
If the window is the next 6 months, I would say the biggest strategic mistake America could take or fall prey to is to think that you can negotiate your way out of this crisis with the Islamic Republic. And a derivative consequence of that would be to not task the intelligence community with coming up with ways to go full force against this regime to push past it. When we talked previously about unleashing the IC, it would be a real mistake to not be doing that now. 6 months may not be enough time to fix the munitions crisis in the country. It might be okay to get you past the oil market issue. It might be okay to get you past the media issue. And we'll be in a fundamentally new place vis-a-vis the midterms. But all of that time spent would be for naught if it did not mean that the U.S. didn't take the break, the pause that it got, and it seems to be that quite quickly the pause is coming to an end, to really realign its tactics with its strategy. There was a quote in Axios recently that I think should, even on hawks, shock Americans, which was an unnamed U.S. official saying they're going to slap around the Islamic Republic a bit. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but the question is, to what end? We're going to slap them to do what? To go back to the negotiating table? Slap them to do what? To get them to treat their people better? Slap them to do what? To get us to give them something? Maybe the highly enriched. What is the purpose of this? Punishment is understood abstractly, but what is the overall purpose? Seems to be the missing ingredient that we have to funnel all of these successes through. Otherwise, America, with the use of force, is slowly moving into the predicament that Israel has faced in the region for a very long time, which is a whole host of military wins, many of which have been failed to translate into political wins that changes the geostrategic environment. This is what the real danger is of not using this time to think about how do we get past the fact that Iran is home to the most anti-American government in the region, yet the most pro-American population in the heartland of the Muslim Middle East. How do we do something with this? That has to be addressed.
Now, obviously, President Trump is the first president to confront the Islamic Republic militarily. What do you think President Trump understands about the regime that previous presidents never fully grasped?
Well, just recently, I mean, the president was using the bully pulpit in a very kind of creative way, calling the regime's leaders scum. But the joke was in term one, and he followed up with saying, he's seen their true color and things like that. But the joke in Persian in term one was that in all the 4 decades of U.S. Iran policy, there was really only one president that was I'm going to use the word in Persian, afun shenas, that really understood the clerics, that understood the language that they responded to, which is the language of power. And that is not divorced from the personality or the politics surrounding Trump. He's willing to be a bull in a china shop for good and for ill. And in the case of the Iran file, doing the unconventional thing, going where others haven't gone, had yielded success for him. Maximum pressure sanctions, leaving the Iran nuclear deal, sanctioning the IRGC as a terrorist organization, striking Soleimani. These were historic wins that he had by going against the mainstream conventional wisdom. And that did yield him with many successes. But as the Islamic Republic has punched back, there is a need for America to kind of recalibrate. And the question is, where is Donald Trump in the space of this recalibration? It can't be to go back to the factory setting that you speak tough, but when the adversary punches back, you go back to being more deal maker in chief than commander in chief. Now, recently, the president's rhetoric and actions on the ground is trying to change that. But Iran's strategy here is to try to run the clock and limit it. And do I think this stems from, I don't know, an understanding of the nature of power in Tehran or the structure of government in Tehran? No, I don't. I think those are empirics that, with immense respect, the president doesn't bother himself with. I think he sees something very plain, which is a power imbalance, and he sees a history, which is the 47-year history of the Islamic Republic. He's conversant in both, and he's willing to do something about the power imbalance, given that history, simply because it exists. The president is someone who doesn't look at the leverage that he has. He uses the leverage that he has once he realizes it's there. It's almost very out there. It's very almost kind of transactional, which is why the great kind of sin, if you will, of the MOU was that it seemed like the U.S., despite all the attacks of this administration being businessmen and seeing something to be transactional, was that all of a sudden it looked like America was trying to do something transformational with a regime that refuses to transform. And so that's where I think the president's action comes from, which is not understanding the nature of power in Iran, but understanding the nature of leverage and understanding the 47-year U.S.-Iran history and just being willing to go there. And that is seen in other areas as well.
And some people were saying that Israel dragged him into this. Netanyahu was in his ear and this and that. Others will say that you can't really convince Trump to do anything that he doesn't want to do. Where does the truth lie?
I mean, to be brutally honest, we won't know the balance, but a lot will depend on what you believe. And it's kind of like this saying, where you stand in life depends on where you sit. If you were an Israel skeptic before, you're going to look at the news, you're going to look at the books coming out, you're going to look at the podcasts coming out, and that's just going to be confirmation bias. And if you were a supporter before, well, then it's going to be the exact opposite situation. And I don't mean to even Steven it, but the problem is the people on this side, like that new book called Regime Change, talks about, is based on a New York Times article that basically talks about how in early January, Prime Minister Netanyahu came. But for some reason, we can't forget, this can't forget about what the president said shoulder to shoulder with Bibi to the American press days before Bibi's other trip to the White House, which was, he said that they would be treating the ballistic missile threat from Iran on the same caliber as the nuclear threat, which means essentially there would be another conflict again. And it wasn't the Israelis in the month of January, no matter if you believe the idea put forward in the book and in the article in the New York Times or not about here's the pitch and here's what we do and here's how it looks and here's what Rubio said and here's what Vance said. That's the Kremlinology of DC, which is always the Kremlinology of DC. It's nice, it's informative, but to a certain degree. And beyond a certain vantage point, it has an expiration date. Because I don't think you can push Donald Trump into something, but I do think people have, and people try to pitch and frame things for the president all the time within the White House today, within the Republican Party today. I mean, the president is very unique in this regard because he's driving two cars at the same time. He's adrift of two currents at the same time. The new Republican right and its views on isolationism in Israel, and the old Republican right and its views on internationalism in Israel. And in the middle of this lies post-October 7, Gaza, Iran, Lebanon, Syria. And all these issues are being adjudicated the same way. So suffice to say, I think the president in December said what he said about the missile threat, which, if you know anything about this man and what he is willing to do, that meant that there was a matter of when, not if, there would be another U.S.-Iran war. Second, if you look at the month of January, the Israelis were actually quiet, eerily quiet in the month of January during much of the protests. They were very loud about the protests between end of the 12-day war and what became protests in late December, early January. That period in between, they were trying to drive protests. But once the second round actually happened, once the round of protests actually happened in January, the Israelis were fairly quiet. So much so that even Iranians who were still able to get messages out were saying, "Where is Bibi?" compared to where he was in 2025. It was Donald Trump, not Bibi, who was out there in the most historic way possible. And no one had told him to do this. In fact, probably the national security establishment in the States was wondering from where it came from. And I think that goes back to the president's understanding not of Iran, but of the nature of power. Seeing a regime that is this regime engage in that kind of a slaughter. No one needed to tell him. The truth was there raw, right before his very eyes. And he drew a red line, not once, not twice, 8 or 9 times, depending on how you count, in the month of January. And that wasn't Bibi, that wasn't Rubio, that wasn't Vance, that wasn't Kushner, that wasn't Witkoff, that wasn't America, that was just the president seeing something and reacting to it. And that reaction and that scene, unfortunately, is missing from the conversation today. We're talking about sanctions. We're talking about Strait of Hormuz. We're talking about who's to blame. We forgot how we got here, and we forgot the nature of the threat, and we forgot how this is a 47-year campaign, and we forgot how the same people shooting at us and the Israelis are the same people who did the very same things that the president was critical of. So no, I don't think the president was boxed in. I'm sure friends and allies have plans, and I'm sure friends and allies try to pull the president in every direction, just like even within a president's own cabinet, there are different views, and any skillful politician will try to bring the president aboard. What do you think on one side Lindsey Graham does? What do you think on the other side AOC does as they try to play for a constituency that exists in this gigantic voter base that was the Trump voter base in 2024? This is a democracy. Everyone is trying to get a piece of the action. That's not the crime. The mistake, if I can quote the famous French diplomat Talleyrand, who said, "It's worse than a crime, it's a mistake." The mistake is to deny the most powerful, democratic, elected figure in the world of agency. That's the mistake. And I tell, press this all the time who want to figure out who's up, who's down. I tell them we all made a mistake in Trump term 1, which is to say, oh, he had lunch with Pompeo today. Oh, he had, dinner with this guy today. This ideology is up. The president, more than anyone else, is driving the train on Iran policy. Yes, it's a smaller cadre of folks. Yes, it's more political than technical or expertise, but that's the team he's chosen. And he has a view. And he has a very strong view. And to pay attention to everybody else, but to the most important person, is worse than a crime. It's a mistake.
What do you think are the differences between the goals that Israel has in this war and the United States has, and where does regime change come in there? Because it seems like the only way out is regime change, but it's not really a stated goal. What are your thoughts on that?
This also is political in the sense that, some believe that the president can't articulate a regime change policy because of the politics here. And so some believe that it's always been operating in the background. I actually think in Trump term 1, it was never operating at all. I believe the president, when he had those 12 points issued by Secretary Pompeo in term 1, the goal was behavior change. And I believe the president has tried very, very hard in term 2 to perhaps, even if he can't get behavior change, to get a deal that puts him in a favorable position. I believe the president believes the things that he's saying. But on the flip side, if we take account of everything the president has said, there is no way I, as a first generation Iranian American working on Iran policy in DC, cannot forget about those statements in January 2026 and to what purpose, to what larger strategic purpose they would serve, and cannot forget about, I think, his best speech on Iran, which was February 28th, 2026, in the wee hours of the morning once the operations began, which those two things together made it look like U.S. policy was regime change. The rest of it wasn't. Again, if we're going to do this as a cocktail, the vast majority of it wasn't. You look at the statements surrounding the resurrection of maximum pressure. There's barely one thing on human rights in there. So I do think to that end, America, by virtue of, as we've mentioned before, distance, time, geography from this threat, can be content with behavior change. The challenge intellectually, analytically, is that this is a regime that is not going to really moderate its behavior and will resist vociferously and will only really worsen the behavior once they realize, this is something you're trying to take away from them, just like we saw with the Strait. The Israelis, I think, fundamentally different. Regardless of your view on what the debate was nationally, I think post-October 7, there's an awakening in that country, politically, socially, leading to something different militarily and strategically, which is that threat is simply not going to be tolerated. To have to deal with a ring of fire like that, to have to deal with an adversary with that much cash and that much capability simply isn't going to be tolerated. So yes, in the long run, I do think the Israelis would like regime change. In the medium run, that means that it's a bumpier road. But in the short run, I think there's lots of things that the Israelis and the Americans have overlap over. And it's about, keeping the Venn diagrams interconnected rather than letting them become separate circles.
Now, you've consistently argued that the Iranian people are the key to Iran's future. Why do so many policymakers still underestimate the people of Iran?
It's such an important question because policymakers are not divorced from the social and political context they come from. Iraq and the Iraq War and the politics of getting to Iraq is, if I use the word hangover, it would be an understatement of the century here in Washington about how toxic that debate is. It's so toxic that I fear that people haven't even really learned the lessons of it. Last year at FDD, this is not a diversion, but it's an important point for your audience. Last year at FDD, I had an event with two former CIA people. It was a public event, it's online, both of whom were in the CIA, and then later, moved out, someone deeper into the U.S. government, someone into the think tank world. And they had worked on Iran, they'd worked on Iraq, and they were both from two very different Republican and Democratic vantage points supportive of the 2003 Iraq War. But they also knew about the situation. They were in government in the previous Iraq War, which was the 91 war. And everyone in D.C. is trying to avoid a 2003, but they seem to have gotten themselves into a 91, where there's a military win and we don't know what to do. And containment looks messy. And when the adversary punches, do we punch back? And there is a road to how we got to 2003. And to so many who are keen not to go down this road, all they do is they close their eyes. And worse, they close their eyes not just to things that would be a strategic win, but a moral win for America. And they close their eyes, and they actually, by doing so, they bring us closer, not further, from a catastrophic situation with respect to Iran. Sorry.
Mm-hmm.
And a desire to avoid an Iraq-type scenario is one major reason why policymakers have avoided talking about the Iran issue in this way. The second is, and I think with respect, this is more of a trope, but it is said, it's about Iran internally. There's no organized opposition. If there's one man on this earth that I think can draw a crowd bigger than Donald Trump, both inside and outside Iran, as we saw in January inside and February outside, is, in my view, exiled Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi. But for some reason, in many of these same policy circles that want to avoid an Iraq 2003 scenario, there's some weird linkage of this to Chalabi syndrome. I don't remember anybody in Iraq going out to protest for Ahmed Chalabi. I don't remember thousands, millions going out to protest his name. I don't remember people going to the birthplace of Saddam Hussein chanting Ahmed Chalabi, but in January, people went to Khomeini, the small town in central Iran, and chanted Javid Shah, chanted Long Live the King. You couldn't have a better referendum on this government than what the people in Iran showed you in January. But I think the Iraq hangover, if we're going to make this a cocktail, the Iraq hangover, the slur of the opposition not existing or not being organized, and the allergy to the Pahlavi name has kind of put us in this position of having to accept a whole host of other bad options, to which a whole host of deal makers and pressure skeptics come in and say, this is the least bad option, negotiating with and placating the Islamic Republic.
Do you think that the Iranian people are afraid to come out again and protest after tens of thousands of them were slaughtered? Will we see them come out and protest again?
You know, I actually believe that we're getting to a point where protests, absent a larger strategy that synchronizes it, is going to have diminishing returns because of the violence. But when I hear from voices inside Iran, I got to tell you, if you had to put a finger on the main sentiment is not fear. And this is something that is really misunderstood given the crackdown, given the two, not one, but two internet outages we had in Iran this year, the second one being the longest recorded internet blackout in history during the course of the war and the ceasefire. The main emotion you get speaking with people, hearing from people inside Iran is anger, is frustration, is disappointment. Fear is there, but is much, much, much further down the list. At this point, it is, well, at what point will you have our back? How much more would you expect of unarmed people? That, to those who say, when will they come out? I would say they just did, and people claim to have their back and they got slaughtered. I mean, fool me once. So to a certain point, I do believe there is that I don't believe that's buyer's remorse, but I do believe that exists among the population. So there needs to be some sort of larger structural shift to make sure that the next time people come out, it's not just another slaughter. And, the tragic part is we've been talking about this, writing for this, calling for this, a protest policy playbook. There will be more protests by virtue of the structure of that state, the inequities among that society, and the fact that the Islamic Republic is a failed state. Food price inflation alone, 140 to 200%. Some of them over 300%, depending on the commodity that you're looking at. This is a failed state if there ever is one. The promise of what that country could be and the peril of what that present reality is. And then you marry on all the strategic things that they're causing in the region that draw America in at a time when generations of American voters are trying to push away from the region. I mean, the argument to support the people writes itself, but to see protests and a rerun of 1979 as a way to get rid of the regime in 2026, I think is a mistake. And I think here the opposition, if they think it is just about street power, there too it will be a mistake. It's going to have to be about state power. It's going to have to be about very different local situations. And here in the States where you and I live and work, the 250th anniversary was just had. It was not an easy period for the US and the British. Easy, at least, in terms of the fact that it was believed to be an insurrection, a revolt, an armed one, a war. Now, that's not necessarily what I'm calling for, but if you look at what happened inside Iran, inside America, and you try to transpose that lesson to Iran, it tells you that it's going to get much bumpier if that anti-regime sentiment is going to be sustained. And it is a bitter reality. It is a bitter reality. I never thought, in 2019, after 1,500 people were killed in a 6-day internet blackout, I heard from inside Iran about the discourse of self-defense for the first time. Now I'm hearing discourse about how you could how people they're trying to find the tutorial for a Molotov cocktail or defending themselves if someone enters their home looking for a January protester, for example, or defending people who have been shot in the eye and other parts of their body with buckshot, and people are still sheltering people who've been hit in January because those people are too afraid to go to a hospital or to a doctor or to a clinic for fear of being caught, turned in, or killed, or worse. And so they're really defending. There's a defense there that I never thought would exist because it is so survivalist. But that's exactly what the Islamic Republic has wrought, and that's exactly the sentiment that exists in parts of society today.
Behnam, thank you so much for this conversation. It's truly has been a pleasure. I've learned so much over this hour. How can people follow you, read what you write, and learn more from you?
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. I am on Twitter, or X as they call it now, after many years of avoiding it. My handle is at the real Behnam BT, and then they can find media appearances and writings and analysis on the FDD website if they navigate over to FD.
Thank you again, and I hope to speak to you again in the near future.
Absolutely. Thank you.